Hey there, IT 140 students. So in this recording, we're going to go through some of the kind of more advanced topics, other things to be familiar with as you move through Chapter 5. So first thing we're going to talk about is scope. We have kind of mentioned it previously when we defined variables, when we've worked with loops and if statements. So scope means wherever you define a variable is where it's accessible, and it's limited to inside the defined location. So if I define a variable, so here's our script. If I define a variable centimeters per inch, it's outside of any function, if statement, loop, it's not defined in anything, then this is global to this file. Global means it's accessible anywhere. However, if I come in here and I have a variable called total inches, this variable is only available inside this method right here, okay? So this is a really good example. We want to have total inches, um, where we take the feet and inches, get converted to a sum. We only care about that inside this method right here. It should not be defined outside of the function. So this would be a local variable, we say. This would be a global variable, okay? Now, the rule of thumb is this: you want to limit the scope as much as possible. You do not want to have as many variables as possible at the global level. So the reason this is global, you might have multiple cases where you need to use a conversion factor of centimeters per inch. So this is a constant. Same idea here, inches per foot. You know that that's a constant. There's 12 inches always in a foot. But the total inches, that's something that's going to get calculated inside this method. We don't care about it outside of the method, okay? So again, they kind of just talk about the same thing. If we really want to have a variable be defined globally inside a method, then you can use a global statement with it. I'm not a big fan of that. While you can do it, I don't recommend it. But that's the main idea that I want to get through here is always limit the scope of the variables, keep them restricted to where access is needed. So then they provide in 5.11, they talk about namespaces and scope resolution. So what a namespace does is it's going to map names to objects. In Python, everything is an object. And what we want to do, so if I have this in a file, if I print globals, I'm only going to get an empty set. If I create a variable and then print globals, I'm going to get my var, what its value contains. If I define a function, now I'm going to get not only the function but the variable. So as things get defined, they are in the namespace, and the globals contains all of the global variables. Again, they talk about some more scope, where things can be defined. So there are some things that are just built in. So the int, converting to string, list, range functions, these are all part of the Python standard library. Built-in scope means it's available anywhere and everywhere. Again, I mentioned global scope, anything that's defined outside of a function. And then local is anything either in a function or in a loop or in an if statement, okay? So that's kind of just the big ideas I want to take care of there. All right, back in the first recording, we talked about arguments and parameters. Here we want to go into a little bit more detail and talk about the fact that when I pass in an argument to a function, it's passed by object reference, which means it's passed by assignment, where we get the value with a new local variable being created. So what that means here is this. So when I define the function birthday with age as a parameter, if I manipulate age and add 1 to it, I'm not doing anything to the actual value that got passed to it. So the variable Timmy age, that's 7. Really what we're doing is we're passing the number 7 to this method. And even though this is updating that variable, this is only the parameter. It's not updating this value right here. Okay, so the concept here is Python is not going to change this primitive data type inside this function. That's because strings and integers, those types, we say are immutable. You can't change their value outside of its scope. However, if the object is mutable, if I have a list or an object that we create later on, which we'll talk about later on in our class, those things, when you pass them, you can change them inside the method. So one rule of thumb that I have as a developer is I try to avoid manipulating and changing the value of my parameter. Um, in some programming languages, I can't do it regardless, so I just try to keep that in mind and then enforce that in languages that can. So if I don't manipulate the value that got passed in here, then I know that the original value is still good. And again, keep in mind, really, if I'm doing a birthday, uh, obviously this is just adding one, so it's not really a good example. But I would return what the next age is going to be, and then I can reassign it to a variable. Okay, next section we're going to take a look at here. So in the previous recording, we talked about the fact that when you define a function, especially when you start having multiple parameter values, the order in which you pass things has to stay true. So I have to give it the title, I have to give it the author, I have to give it the publisher, we have to give it the year, we have to give the version, the number of chapters, the number of pages. They have to be in order. However, Python does let us use the parameter name in the call of the function. So now I can say title equals. So remember, title, that's this right here. Title equals, and then I give it the value. Publisher equals, and then I give it the publisher. Author equals, and then I give it the actual value. So this is going to pass into that parameter this value. Same thing here. This is going to pass into the parameter publisher this value. And oh, by the way, the initial setup is title, author, publisher. Look, they're going title, then publisher, then year, then author. So you can mix the order of these by using the named parameter value. Okay, so that's kind of a nice thing, especially when you have multiple parameters. Ideally, there should be no more than 5-ish parameters to a method without then saying, oops, I swapped out the number of chapters, number of pages, and now my method doesn't work properly. The next thing they do is they also say that you can provide a default parameter value. So we can define our method. We're going to have a day, a month, and a year, and we might have some kind of style code associated with it. And we can default it what it is. So what this means is if I want to, I can provide a value for it. Or if I don't provide a value for it, it's going to be given a 0. So we can see here, here's print date. I'm going to give it 37/2012 and style equals 0. That's going to override what this is. 37/2012, this time passing 1 as the style. And then again, if I don't pass anything, then by default, it's going to get this 0 right here. Oh, by the way, most programming languages, if you do this, once you define a parameter with a default value, each and every single one after it has to have a default value. So you leave those to the end. All right, we move on to the next section. In the next section, we can have in Python a parameter that is a list, and it could be any size list. So we might be making a sandwich, and you're going to want bread, you're going to want some kind of meat, and then we can use the keyword args with a star out in front, which means I can pass this a list of any size. And what might this list of any size be? Well, it would be the toppings and condiments that you want on your sandwich. So I have to pass in a bread, I have to pass in a meat. So here we go, sourdough, turkey, and we pass in mayo. Or I'm going to put wheat on ham, and I'm going to have these condiments, mustard, tomato, and lettuce. So again, the star args is utilized in the parameter list. And then I can check to see it's a list, so I can check if its length is greater than 0. If that's the case, then I know that there are multiple values in there, and I can loop through them as well. So the KWArgs is where you have a dictionary of keywords with a value. So same notation. The double star means we're going to have a key and a value. And so when I call it, I have to provide it not only a key, but a value. So I've got a sauce, that's mayo. We've got sauce 1, mustard, veggie 1, tomato, veggie 2, lettuce, and so forth. Again, these are a little bit more advanced concepts. Be familiar with them for your zyBooks here, but in implementation, you probably won't do that for our purposes. Python lets you return multiple outputs from a function. So in the first recording, we calculated pizza area and pizza volume. We returned a single value. But Python does let you return multiple outputs. And we'll take a look at an example here. So we got some student scores. We're going to calculate the mean. We're going to calculate the standard deviation. And then you can see that they have a return statement that returns mean, comma, standard deviation. So this returns back two values. It returns back a tuple. Now, in my opinion, doing something like this shouldn't be performed. What we should do is we should have a method that says calculate average, and then we should have a separate method that calculates the standard deviation. I like to have my functions perform just one task. This is performing two tasks, getting the mean, getting the standard deviation. Anyways, I can return multiple values and then take a look at the usage here. I called the get grade stats. I'm going to provide it that list of scores. And then the return value, remember, anytime you have a return value, it's used in an assignment statement. So the average comes first. Okay, so average or mean comes first, standard deviation comes second. So I need to make sure that my variables are going to unpack that tuple properly. If I reverse these, if I put standard deviation, comma, average, then when I come down here to do my outputs, those variables are going to be incorrect. So I have to make sure that I know exactly what this method is going to return. How do I know what that method is going to return? Well, that leads us to our next section. So how to document your functions. And this is the same thing that is in our code guidelines posted in the announcements. We use what are called doc strings in Python to document our methods. So on the line underneath the method, we use triple quotes. So if you're in PyCharm, you just hit triple quotes, press enter, and it will fill in some of the information for you. So if you have parameter values, it would provide arguments and then origin, destination, and so forth. If you have optionals, things that are going to default to a value, it would provide that as well. But the idea here is when I hit the triple quotes and press enter, it'll fill in the other quote for you. This is where I tell the user of my function what this does. And then here, I'm providing details about the arguments. So I give it the name and what it should be. And then if I scroll down, do they have a return one? If I had a return statement, I would also put in here. So let me just copy this. So if I had a return statement, I would say something like returns. In this case, it is the ticket price based on origin, destination, etc. Okay, so this documentation right here is very powerful because in PyCharm, when I hover over this, I will see the parameters, the description, and so forth. And if I have a tuple like we did right back here, I could say something like returns average, comma, standard deviation. So when I hover over my method, like this right here, if I hover over it in an IDE, when I use it, it's going to tell me what gets returned, how I use it, what I have to pass to it, and so forth. So anytime that you have to write a method, you need to document it in this format right here. This is not part of the comment. That's just saying, oh, there's more to the body of this method. Okay. All right. So that's going to do it for chapter 5. I'll talk to you next time.